Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 294. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Curtis Fuller and his quintet, Blues-ette. Now, this came out on Savoy, originally in 1960. I have a 1977 Japanese reissue on Arista, about which I have no strong feelings other than to say it sounds good. Other than Art Farmer being absent, this is effectively the debut record of what would become known as the Jazztet. And it has on the cover this fantastic picture by Hank Schneider, who did a whole bunch of different covers for Savoy. I tried to find out more about that image because it's a photo, but I came up dry. So Curtis Fuller was one of the good guys in jazz. He was supremely talented, he was equally humble, and he was a champion of what was an unlikely instrument, the trombone, in the world of hard bop in New York in the 1950s. As a recording artist, he was prolific between 1957 and 1967, at which point he walked away. Eventually he came back to music, but he'll always be best known as one of the greatest exponents of hard bop. Curtis Fuller was born in December 1932 in Detroit to a single mother because his dad had died of TB while his mom was pregnant with him. His sister Mary was a bit of a prodigy on the piano, and Curtis's first musical experiences were listening through the wall to her piano lessons. Their mom died when Curtis was 9, and the kids were separated, and Curtis ends up getting sent to an orphanage run by Jesuits. The first thing he wanted to play was the violin, but a teacher told him, black kids don't play the violin. He became a bit inward. He was one of only 3 non-white kids out of 250 boys at this orphanage, until a nun, who could see what was going on with him, said to him, and this is his recollection, "Let me take you to see your people and see what they do." So she takes him to an Illinois Jacket Band concert, which featured J.J. Johnson on trombone. He was taken with the trombone, which he found majestic. When he got to high school age in Detroit, he attended, like so many budding black musical talents, Cass Technical, where he was in the same class as the trumpeter Donald Byrd. At age 21 in 1953, Fuller was drafted into the Army. I don't think he actually saw any active service in Korea, as far as I can tell, but while he was in the Army, he did play in a band with Cannonball Adderley and Junior Mance. When he got out of the Army, he headed back to Detroit, where he appears on a record for the very first time, kind of a quirky session for Transition Records in Detroit in November 1955. The producer, a young guy called Tom Wilson, who would go on in the 1960s to produce people like Bob Dylan, was a Harvard grad. He'd studied econ there, and on graduation, he'd founded Transition Records. He'd come to Detroit that November to record a sextet led by Pepper Adams, which had a kind of remarkable lineup. In addition to Curtis Fuller on trombone, it included Paul Chambers on bass, Philly Joe Jones on drums, Roland Alexander on keys, and on tenor sax, a guy by the name of John Coltrane. That band recorded 3 tracks that day, but only one of them, a song called Train Strain, was actually released, at least at the time. It was put out the next year on a compilation record called Jazz in Transition. Fuller was then recruited by another Detroit star, Yusef Lateef, and he appears on Lateef's first 4 records, including Jazz for the Thinker, Jazz Moods, Stablemates, which were all on Savoy, and then one more for Verve, Before Dawn. While he already had a performing and recording career, Fuller continued his studies. He was a student at Wayne State, where his roommate was none other than Joe Henderson. In the spring of 1957, Lateef then says, "We're going to go to New York, we're going to make a record." So Lateef and Fuller and the rest of the group show up in Manhattan, and one of the first things they do is find out where Miles Davis is playing, which happened to be the Cafe Bohemia, and go down to take in the show, because of course Miles had often stopped in to Detroit, and they had often played with him. They thought they'd go down and sit in with Miles. But as it happens, during that engagement at the Cafe Bohemia in April 1957, Miles's group was basically on a knife edge because Coltrane was strung out on heroin, Philly Joe was strung out as well. Miles was basically tired of their bullshit and was just about to fire them. So timing being everything, Fuller gets up, sits in with Miles. Miles offers him a job right then and there. So Fuller says to Yusef, "Sorry, I'm out. I'm going to stay in New York. I'm going to play with Miles." He ends up only being able to play with Miles for a few nights because very, very soon Miles then fires Coltrane, he fires Jones, and then he heads into the studio for pretty much the whole month of May with Gil Evans. This, of course, would have been devastating for Fuller were it not for another lucky break, which was that Alfred Lyon, on one of the very few nights that Fuller had played with Davis, had heard Fuller play, thought he was amazing, loved his tone, and walked up to him and said, "Look, I want to record you. Come to the Blue Note Studios." Beginning in May with New Trombone and then through the rest of the year, Fuller ends up making 4 records for Blue Note in 1957, including one with Slide Hampton that's not released until 1980. He also gets lots and lots of work as a sideman, and the most famous example of this is, of course, him sitting in on the recording of Blue Train, where his playing is magnificent, not only in the title track, where he contributes so much to the head arrangement, but also in his solo in the title track, where he just picks up in a very effortless way the threads of Lee Morgan's solo. Shortly after this, he also ends up playing with Billie Holiday at Lester Young's request, and it was Billie Holiday that he credits with encouraging him to slow the cadence of his soloing down to match the pattern of the human voice. And so after just 8 months in New York, Fuller had made 6 records as a leader, 15 as a sideman, and had established himself as basically the go-to trombone player in the hard bop scene. Then in 1958, he made a connection with another musician which would prove to be a lasting one, and this was Benny Golson. Both of them had been on the recording date for Abbey Lincoln's record, It's Magic, in the summer of that year. Then in the fall, Golson was leading a date for Riverside. He asked Fuller to come and join the band for the session. They completely clicked musically and decided they wanted to keep working together. They ended up making many records together, including this one, but also the Curtis Fuller Jazztet. And then when Golson gets together with Art Farmer and they decide to create a band called the Jazztet, Fuller is the obvious choice for the trombone chair. Fuller makes a great contribution to the Jazztet, and then in 1961 he left for Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers, where he stayed for 4 years and ends up writing a whole bunch of tracks for which the Jazz Messengers were very well known, which have since become hard bop standards, things like Buhana's Delight and Arabia. On the personal front, Fuller had always been very close to John Coltrane since they'd met in 1955, and he was absolutely devastated in 1967 when both his sister and John Coltrane died within months of each other. He's too devastated to play. He leaves music and he goes and gets a job at Chrysler, leading an import-export division, which he does for 2 years until Dizzy Gillespie figures out where he is and comes and rousts him out and gets him to come on a world tour and gets Fuller back into music. And while he returned to music and would make some great records in the years to come, little could match that burst of incredible creative energy that he had and that he was part of in the late 50s and early 1960s, of which this record is perhaps the best example. This record is made on May 21st, 1959 at Rudy Van Gelder's home studio in Hackensack, New Jersey, and the producer is a guy called Ozzie Cadena. Cadena was the in-house producer for Savoy Records in the late 50s. He's got something like 100 producing credits for them. This record is not as bright and crisp and punchy in some ways as a Blue Note recording might have been, but I actually find that to be a good thing, and I find myself now thinking I gotta listen to more Ozzie Cadena productions. The whole record has kind of a deep, soft feel, partly I think because of the combination of the two lead instruments, the saxophone and the trombone. But although it sounds deep and soft, I gotta be clear, this record does not lack high-end or detail. Curtis Fuller's on trombone, Benny Golson's on sax, the piano is handled by fellow Detroit native and the consummate reliable sideman Tommy Flanagan. On bass is Jimmy Garrison. This is the first of, I think, 3 consecutive Savoy records with Fuller for Garrison. And on drums is Al Harewood, who was no stranger to trombone-led groups, having made his name in the mid-1950s in groups led by J.J. Johnson and Kai Winding. Side 1 starts with 5 Spot After Dark, which provides us with the first of a whole bunch of fantastic head arrangement riffs that this record is just chock full of. The playing and the production are laid back and mellow, but you're still captivated, and Fuller's playing in particular is understated. He perhaps is taking Billie Holiday's advice. Undecided has some very tasty unison playing in the head arrangement, and Fuller's solo makes really effective use of blank space. And on the title track, Blues-ette, the highlight is Fuller playing a muted trombone over top of a walking Jimmy Garrison bass line. On side 2, Minor Vamp starts off with more pillowy soft unison playing and then some ace solos from Fuller, Flanagan, and Golson. Love Your Spell Is Everywhere gives us more upbeat magic, more gentle, enticing head arrangements, and more excellent soloing. If you wanted to quibble, you could maybe say Garrison is perhaps the least impressive of the soloists, but he's still pretty good, and that's just splitting hairs. And the record ends with 12-inch, which is a great track all day long, but my favorite part is this descending lick, which Golson pulls off about a third of the way through his solo. The very end of the 1950s was a pretty big moment in jazz. People like Coltrane and Davis and Coleman and Dolphy were questioning the whole foundations of hard bop and its assumptions, but hard bop in the hands of a band that can really swing will always be a beautiful thing, and that's particularly true when the band includes Fuller and Golson, whose unison playing is just something else. This record is incredibly hummable, it swings really hard, and like a lot of really great records, you'll find yourself lost in the experience without really wondering or caring which track is which. So I can't really imagine anyone disliking this. If you don't have it, get it. And for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.